Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I currently serve on the board of the Interreligious Council of Linn County and am the president of the Humanists of Linn County. On this morning's show, we're going to be discussing gun violence and the Second Amendment. And here to discuss this controversial but I think much needed topic, I have three panelists with us today. I'd like each of you just to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why this particular topic is important to you.
Sure thing. Well, I'm Paul Gowder. I'm a professor of law at the University of Iowa. I teach constitutional law, and so every year I spend some time going through the Second Amendment with my students and just trying to sort out the limited guidance that the Supreme Court has given us on this issue.
Thank you.
My name is Bill Nicholson, born and raised here in Cedar Rapids, veteran of the United States Army. I'm an attorney, husband and father, and citizen of the state of Iowa.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I'm Adam Sullivan. I live in Iowa City. I'm a columnist at the Gazette, and I like to highlight conservative and libertarian positions. And so certainly I cover Second Amendment and gun issues from time to time, and I consider myself a gun rights enthusiast.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you. Let's jump right into this topic. And you know, it is something we find ourselves kind of coming back to every so often, and certainly in the last few weeks, if anybody's been paying attention to the news, we've had several mass shootings with the Tree of Life Synagogue and other places, and unfortunately it's almost hard to keep track of. And then just random gun violence that we're dealing with, locally, but it's certainly here in the United States. And it seems to be that oftentimes you just have a lot of the same conversation over and over again. But what I did find is, as of recent, the Second Amendment is coming up a lot more, and I think the conversation is changing to where maybe do we need to have a Second Amendment? Is it that important? And of course, talks of repealing the Second Amendment, so on and so forth. And of course, these raise all sorts of emotions. And Paul, you were talking about earlier how when some of your students come into law school for their first year, there is just a lot of ignorance sometimes around not only just the Second Amendment, but the Constitution, the Bill of Rights in general. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, there's people that are very passionate about, for instance, the Second Amendment. When you ask them, well, what is the Second Amendment? They're almost at a loss sometimes to state what it actually says. But why do you think there is that?
Yeah, so I think there's really two reasons for that. And first is, honestly, our education system is not doing a very good job at teaching civics right now. And so, I've just, our students at the University of Iowa are truly excellent. They're easily in the top 5 to 10% of law students nationwide. But even our students still come in with just not a lot of prior education. And the second thing is our political discourse really, I think partly as a result of the politicization of the Supreme Court, has sort of become people trading kind of, whatever their intuition happens to believe about the world as legal claims now in the public sphere. And it's really, we haven't done a good job of separating the political from the legal.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of dive into the Second Amendment, a little history behind it, and see where the conversation leads. And then probably, latter half of the conversation, get into gun violence, and is there a connection between the two? And then talk about some solutions, and hopefully we can cover some new territory with a subject that gets a lot of discussion. So just to start out, what is the Second Amendment? Well, it states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. So it's a very simple one-sentence statement that has created all kinds of controversy. And so the first thing that people focus on is the militia. What do they refer to? What is the militia? Is that something that exists today? Is this rights that were just granted to the militia? Do we have any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting to put things into perspective is, so our founding fathers, the people who wrote these documents, were against having a standing army, right? And so now we have a very large army that's it's in more than 100 countries around the world. They're stationed in places around the United States, and we also have police that increasingly look like the military, right? And so I think for the people who wrote this document in that historical context, and you gentlemen can fill in what I'm missing here, they thought that it was necessary for people to have some firepower in case there was, because they didn't think that there was going to be army guys standing by ready to go, right? And so I think in that historical context, when they didn't envision that there would be a standing army, there needed to be people with weapons. And so I think to apply what the militia meant to modern times, I think it's really tough to apply.
Yeah. And one of the quotes I came across was from George Mason, who was an early American who was very influential in drafting the Bill of Rights. And he had a quote that when asked, who are the militia, he says, they consist now, this was late 18th century, consists now of the whole people, except a few public officers. And so, of course, in today's terms, does that make sense, right? I mean, in his mind, of course, it was, we need to have a standing militia to kind of repel against or prevent a tyrannical government, right? Which obviously they had just come out of a Revolutionary War, and it made sense that we needed to, preserve this newfound country, and we need to have a militia that apparently is everyone, right? So arm every man, woman, and child. But I mean, do you feel like this interpretation should apply today?
So to my mind, the most interesting part is less the militia and more the well-regulated, right? I mean, yes, we live in a very different world for exactly the reasons that we just heard with respect to standing armies, but if we think that the basis of private ownership of weapons is something like collective self-defense, then we have to start talking about the other preconditions for collective as opposed to individual self-defense. What would it mean to have armed citizens that were actually closely connected to the operation of democracy, as opposed to right now, where essentially what we have is armed citizens seeing being armed as a wholly private right, unconnected to the security of a free state.
Yeah, and there is definitely that kind of evolution that's taken place over the last couple hundred years, where there's been a shift away from the focus on the militia to the rights of the people, right? And what are the people, to bear arms
Individually.
Yeah.
But I think it also deserves to be said that there are many who do focus on the militia aspect of it, and there are many who focus on the idea of even going back to pre-revolutionary, where the individuals had a right and an obligation to resist an oppressive government. And I think there's a segment of people who interpret those to give them rights today, where they feel the current government may be infringing on their personal liberties, and they derive some strength and comfort from the Second Amendment as supporting their ability to resist the current government, not just the kings of England, but they feel the current government is overreaching and oppressive, and there's a segment of people who reference the Second Amendment as supporting that. I think also, though, the many who have gone beyond that and really see it more as an individual rights and home protection or individual protection issue, and have moved away from sort of the connection to government.
Yeah. Yeah, and Adam, I'm interested in your viewpoint on it. I mean, because a lot of people do, to your point, go back to it as being kind of a symbolic, almost. We have to resist it. It's almost as have something in place that stands for our freedom and allows us to resist potentially a tyrannical government. It's as American as apple pie, and you can't take that away from us. Do you feel like there is, Adam, a a real need to have, for instance, the Second Amendment in place to protect us against what would be, I guess, a rogue military? Or
I guess it's hard to say if it is a requirement, because we live in a country where that's always been the case, where at least in my lifetime and for years before, individuals did have powerful firearms. I think one mistake people make is that the argument isn't that the people could overthrow a tyrannical government. It's that they could make it really messy and untenable for the government to overreach. And so we have, when Waco happens, or Ruby Ridge happens, or the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, those look really bad for the government, and the government doesn't want those things to happen, right? The government doesn't want to kill people, civilians with bombs, right? But people having a lot of firearms forces the government's hand in some situations. And so you're not going to see, farmers with rifles storm the Capitol and the White House and take over the government. But you are going to see, and we do see this, that people can keep the government in check. And that's why we don't have gun confiscation in this country.
I think that's a good point. I read something the other day about, maybe it was a conversation I had with somebody where I was talking about how, well, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. These are, there's armed militias or armed people that have, in some sense, made it very messy and difficult for the most powerful military in the world to maintain control and to take over, if you will, control of their country. And so some people have said, well, that's why we need to have an armed citizenry, right? So in the event that there was some sort of rogue government, that we would make it messy. And I think that's somewhat of the point you're making. Yeah. But I'm wondering if that's if that's a risk that's even...
I have some worries about that, right?
Okay.
I mean, the examples that you cite, right, Waco, as a prominent one. So I can certainly see situations where I might want to say, on behalf of armed citizens, okay, we have individual rights that are being systematically infringed by the government, and armed resistance is appropriate. And we've actually seen that, right? I mean, we saw that with the Black Panthers in particular, where the Black Panthers bore arms to resist, astonishing police oppression. The thing about the Black Panthers, though, is that that movement was very swiftly put down. And, today, I would say the Second Amendment rights, while they're certainly real for citizens of majority races, we should say, they're not particularly real for black citizens, and we've seen that with the astonishing number of police killings of African Americans. But I think that, that suggests, it concerns me that the examples we leap to of real-world successful people using being armed to resist government overreach. Somebody's got a wacky religious movement that's maybe acting ethically, maybe not, sort of forming a compound. But when we have genuine cases of government abusing individual rights, the practical implication of private ownership of arms doesn't seem to be effective.
Yeah.
Oh.
The thing that has sort of interested me about this concept of the public is, so when I grew up watching Westerns on TV, you came into town and the marshal took your gun. And the marshal took your gun, and they said, you might get drunk and you might shoot up the town.
Yeah.
And sure, they gave him and there was no question. There was not a lot of, it was the marshal was the good guy. And there was never a question that the marshal was completely within his right to take to take the guns from the cowhands, because they could be dangerous. Now, it seems to me, if you had a show on television now and somebody came into town and the town marshal said, you're carrying a gun, I'm going to take it away, it would be very debatable whether they had the power to do that. And the change in just the discourse in society over my lifetime has been amazing in that regard, because it seemed beyond question that you could limit and take away guns and things like that if that was for the common good, and now it seems to have gone much differently.
I think if we gave sheriffs, for instance, the power as individuals to confiscate weapons, I think the opportunity for abuse there is really obvious, right? And so throughout our history, people of color have been victims of gun
But
control.
there probably would be no greater opportunity for that now than in 1849.
And
right?
certainly, and I'm sure
And
that
back then there was no, it seems,
And so don't
I'm
you
just talking about
suppose-
the attitude in the 50s and
right.
60s.
And don't you suppose that people of color maybe were had their guns taken in those situations more than white folks?
I'm sure. My point, though, was that back when Matt Dillon and Gunsmoke, when
Right.
they took those guns, it didn't raise any controversy. It wasn't a question of should he have this power or not. Absolutely, there could be an abuse of power by anybody in a powerful position at any time. My point was the ability of a sheriff to take those weapons wasn't questioned, whereas now it seems like just the sheer ability to take a weapon, now they have to give gun permits, there's shell-issued gun permits, and a much greater emphasis on the individual's right to carry guns than the rights of society in general to be free from gun violence.
Yeah.
That's what, that emphasis has shifted dramatically in my lifetime.
Right. So I think this is a good segue to kind of move towards the issue of gun violence. I mean, certainly we could talk for a long time about the implications of the Second Amendment, and that's a little bit of what we'll talk about here as we move into that. But, you know, as I was researching this, I guess I didn't fully appreciate that constitutionally there is only 3 countries in the world that have a quote right to bear arms within their constitution. One of them is the United States, is the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights, and then there's Mexico and Guatemala. What I found interesting with all 3 of those countries is they did rank fairly high within like the top 15 when it comes to kind of per capita gun violence. Do you feel like, to kind of go back to your Wild West analogy, do you feel like having a Second Amendment does kind of create this, you know, Wild West mentality of, you know, yes, you know, problems can be solved with guns, with more guns, and do you think there's, and this is getting to, should we repeal the Second Amendment, right? Which 6 countries have recently, and is it on the table? Is it something we should consider? What are the implications if we were to do something like that? I put a few questions out there, but.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would even not even go so far as to say mentality, right? I mean, certainly whether or not the, you know, a gun right creates a mentality of turning to guns, it certainly creates the opportunity. I mean, just when you think about the quantity of gun ownership in this country relative to others, I mean, obviously when you have more firearms floating around, you have a lot more opportunity for violence. Does that mean that repeal would solve that, right? Well, that I don't know. I mean, there's a big difference between countries that have never had large numbers of guns versus a country that starts out with large numbers of guns and then.
And that's the difficulty, right? With the United States, we have 290 million guns or something like that in circulation, right? It's amazing, right? And actually, do we? That sounds like a lot, but there's actually countries with far more. And of course, what's always interesting, and I brought with me a few statistics here, but when you start running the numbers, anytime you have a conversation about gun violence, everybody kind of trots out their city or their country that kind of that supports the fact that, oh yeah, look at this city has a whole bunch of guns, their gun violence is low. This city has few guns, but look at the gun violence. So, you know, statistics can be kind of skewed in different ways. But so to that point, to kind of get us into this, so for instance, in Idaho, there's 56.9% of gun ownership with a 0.8 gun murders per 100,000 inhabitants. Right? In Washington, D.C., we have less than half gun ownership at 25.9% with 16.5. So, you know, what's that? 20 times as much gun murders per 100,000 inhabitants. How do you explain that discrepancy, right? What would be your first kind of intuition with that? Population density.
And poverty.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I agree. I definitely agree with both. And I also, you know, economists study opportunity cost. And opportunity cost, I think, plays into violence a lot. which basically means, what's the alternative to taking this course? And so if your life is really bad, if you don't have any professional or educational aspirations or any opportunities, then you have less incentive not to go into a violent lifestyle. So not to join a gang or start being violent, right? And so Washington, D.C. has a ton of poverty, very high population density, and so you have a lot of, especially young people, who don't have any opportunities, and so then they turn to crime, and their opportunity cost for turning to crime is low because their alternative is to live in poverty and be poor and maybe get a job. And so I think poverty especially is very crucial.
And I would think that any Western state, Idaho or others, probably has a greater number of farmers and ranchers and sportsmen whose gun ownership is probably more directly linked to hunting or use traditionally for firearms in that respect. And they're also more experienced and better trained in the use of those weapons than maybe your people in more urban areas are. And so they could have more firearms, but use them differently and be better trained and more knowledgeable about appropriate use of firearms.
Yeah, no, it's kind of the old thing where if you took 1,000 firearms, right, and you dropped it in a affluent neighborhood or randomly dispersed them there, or you went to a kind of impoverished urban community and did the same thing, what would be the result? I think you would see probably a spike in gun violence in the impoverished neighborhood, probably little to no spike gun violence. The correlation, of course, being, affluence and how you're using the gun. Maybe that community is locking their guns up at night, whereas these other ones are being used nefariously, or there isn't, they don't have the resources to protect them, so on and so forth. So, it does kind of get into this. Do you have something you want to say?
The other thing that I'd want to add about that is I think a lot of the kinds of crime that are associated with guns but aren't associated with poverty are also less violent. Not less violent, less visible. The example that immediately comes to mind is domestic violence. It turns out that one of the major consequences of gun ownership is that women in particular often tend to be injured or die at the hands of their partners, and this tends to be less visible just because of the dynamics of domestic violence.
I think it's a great point, and we tend to discuss gun violence as one thing, and I would break it into three groups. There's suicides, there's personal crimes, and then there's mass shootings. Mass shootings obviously tend to gather the most attention. That's when we tend to have these major public policy conversations about guns. That really is a very small percentage of the people who die. And so much greater percentages are suicides, interpersonal violence, partner violence, men on women typically, and then violence on the streets among people who know each other and have some beef with each other. You very rarely see someone just randomly walk up to someone else on the street or in a mall or even in a school and start killing them. And all of those occurrences are really bad, but they all need to be dealt with in different ways, especially acknowledging what you mentioned earlier, that we already have all these guns. So restricting access to new firearms eventually will curb some of those things, but not immediately, and to some extent, not ever. So I think it's important to talk about these are public health issues, they're mental health issues, they're poverty issues, they're gun issues too. That's the one thing that connects them all, but there's also a lot of differences in all those crimes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and that is a great point. And it gets into this idea of the kind of a cost-benefit analysis when it comes to in our society, right? Where, how much are we willing to tolerate when it comes to these guns? On the one hand, we enjoy them for sports, we shooting, for instance, or hunting, or, for full disclosure, I hunt, right, occasionally, and so I own a couple guns. And so I understand that there is, utility there, and there is enjoyment that people get from these. But I'm wondering if we're kind of at a critical mass in our society where we're really having to have this conversation around, okay, on the one hand, there is this benefit of, we'll protect ourselves against a tyrannical government. We have these guns to enjoy. We need to, whatever recreational sport you have. On the other hand, there's these mass shootings. There's this inner city violence. There's the suicides, which increase in their success rate when a firearm is used. So, do you think we're at that point? And how does that conversation do we need to shape it around that? And
I mean, the Supreme Court's made life harder for us, right? So one of the things that the Supreme Court has said in its recent series of cases about the Second Amendment is that self-defense, sort of conceptualized basically as defense against sort of street criminals or something, is a key justification for the Second Amendment right. And because of that, the Supreme Court's made it really hard to have a lot of practical restrictions that would permit things like hunting while making it harder to sort of impulsively grab guns and go out and commit crimes. So, you know, cities have had regulations like requiring ammunition and the firearm to be stored locked and separately, for example, which could do a huge amount of good to stop accidental killings, could potentially, I mean, I'd like to see some science, but at least theoretically, could do something to stop sort of impulse killings. And the Supreme Court has said no. That makes it harder to engage in self-defense, and so that has been struck down. I think that particular problem is a key legal barrier right now.
You know, and when you hear people say everybody has the right to defend themselves, I mean, intuitively you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. I should have the right to defend myself against a criminal. And that's, you know, just a very powerful argument that, you know, people, I think, latch onto and feel like, yeah, that makes sense. But I'm wondering at the same time whether, you know, that holds true, you know, meaning if there were less guns, you know, would there be more people, you know, injured or killed by gun violence? But to kind of, we only just have a couple minutes left. I'd like each one of you, and Paul, you've already somewhat addressed this, but I'd like you to just answer the question, in your own personal opinion, what is the most effective way to reduce gun crime in the United States? Keeping in mind that gun crime has gone down. It has trended downward in the last 20 years, but how do we continue that trend downward? How do we do that? Maybe Adam, I'll start with you.
I don't know what the single best way, but I think the way that is going to make everyone happiest and that aligns with our values best is just to make everyone wealthy, to give everyone the opportunity to be wealthy. And then I think all kinds of bad outcomes, gun crime, other kinds of crime, I think that all dissipates to a large extent.
I would say there needs to be a change and an ability to make reasonable regulation. I think there are certain types of firearms that should be able to be outlawed. I served in the military. I see no civilian use to a high-capacity magazine and certain types of ammunition, as well as certain types of firearms. I don't think that should be unconstitutional and would allow sporting and hunting and many other types of firearms, as well as personal protection with a handgun or something like that. Those all make sense, but there needs to be the ability to regulate them reasonably.
I mean, I'd really agree with both of those and add, get rid of that idea of self-defense. It's kind of a fantasy to imagine that, you know, there's going to be some mugger walking down the street and you can sort of whip out your pistol and put a stop to them. It's a joke. And it's distorted our constitutional as well as our political dialogue on firearms.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And we just have a minute left here, but you know, yeah, sometimes you do see the commercials, right, where the woman or a man was walking down the street and there's a guy with a gun, you know, creeping up the alley, and so they turn and, you know, defend themselves. And, you know, some of that is, you know, it certainly plays well and it certainly gives people the impression that, yes, I am more safe with a gun. But, yeah, statistically, I'm not sure if that plays out in real life. But is there any other, we just have a few seconds left, any other closing comments you'd like to give us here?
I would just say, and you kind of alluded to this at the beginning, it's a really important time to have this conversation because I think people are asking very fundamental questions about our constitutional rights and the Second Amendment. I think 2 years ago, you wouldn't have had a conversation about, do we need the Second Amendment? Now people are questioning that. I think we need it, but I think it's a good conversation to have.
No, this is great. I appreciate each one of you, and we'll have to hopefully do this again because it's a subject I'm sure we'll be talking about on and on in our society, unfortunately. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you have a great Sunday and you'll join us again next week. Take care now. Bye.